This entire military is one cohesive, dedicated force. And the threats to our nations, they don't sleep. They're watching our every move. Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. They may be watching this right now. Our military should not be mistaken for a cable news gabfest show. We don't care what you look like. We don't care who you voted for, who you worship, what you worship, who you love. It doesn't matter if your dad left you millions when he died or if you knew who your father was. We have been honed into a machine of lethal moving parts that you would be wise to avoid if you know what's good for you. We will not be intimidated. We will not back down. We don't want war. But if you want war with the United States of America, there's one thing I can promise you, so help me God. Someone else will raise your sons and daughters.
Opinions expressed. Military Broadcast Radio, the station that's giving veterans a voice.
Find us on the web at mbradio.us.
Opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Find us on the web at mbradio.us.
Join Terry with Tracer Rounds every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central to hear interviews with veteran artists, veteran business owners, and businesses that support veterans. Tune in to see if you're on target. Catch us on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and MB Radio, giving veterans a voice.
Hi, welcome to Tracer Rounds, and I'm your host, Terry, and you're on MBR, where we're giving veterans a voice. You can find us on all the social media accounts, Twitch, X, YouTube, Facebook, Roku, Amazon Fire. And today's veteran who we're giving a voice to is Ian Murray. Welcome, Ian.
All right, thank you.
So Ian, he has a story to tell about his issues, I guess you would say, at his job and how he resolved them. And it's a story of resilience, really. I don't know, it's not for the faint of heart, and I don't know how he held in there so long, but I mean, I think he was entrenched and dug in, and he was just going to make it a point to make a point. And so I appreciate you coming on the show tonight. So I know that you were in the Air Force. Were you in the reserves or the active duty Air Force?
I was originally Air Force Reserves for 4 years, and then since 2006, I've been in the Army components, Guard and Reserve.
Because you went from the Air Force Reserve to the National Guard, the Army National Guard, and then you went to the Army Reserves.
Correct.
Yeah. And you're still actively in the reserves?
Yes, I am.
Yes. So just tell us a little bit about your service in the military, just a little bit, and then we'll start into your story, just so people kind of have the backstory about maybe what you do as a specialty, and then how that relates to how you were entrenched in this battle with your employer.
Sure. Well, I started out my career in the Air Force Reserves. I was security forces. When I was younger, I had some aspirations of becoming a police officer or a federal agent or something like that. And that segued me into corrections in the civilian side. I was a corrections officer in Charleston, South Carolina. That was where my duty station in the Air Force was. I worked for Charleston County in their jail for about 3 years or so. I moved back to Florida in 2009. And after that point, I'd been in the National Guard on the Army side for about 3 years. I switched over from being military police to being a vehicle mechanic. I decided to do something I kind of enjoyed more as a hobby, I guess. I worked on trucks and Humvees and things like that. When I moved to Florida, I was processing into my unit, and one of the Signal Corps guys was looking at my resume and my charts and scores. He's like, "Why are you out there in the motor pool? You should be working on some of our equipment." And I, at this point, I was still an E4 after having been in the military for quite a while. And he said, "Well, Well, let me put it this way. If you cross over to us, I can guarantee you we'll give you your E5 as soon as you graduate. So that was a big motivator. So I crossed MOSs again, got my 5. Finished out my contract with the Guard in 2012 and switched over to the Army Reserves. And I was recruited into the intelligence field, which is what I've been doing for about the last 12 years now. And at the time of me switching to the Guard, or moving back to Florida, I should say, I got another job in corrections with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, which is where this whole debacle kind of happened. It was when I was switching from the Guard to the Reserve, making that transition into the intelligence community, was around the time this whole thing happened, unfortunately. And yeah, it put a big speed bump in my whole career. It really upset a lot of people, especially in the Army, considering the amount of money and time they'd invested in me to that point. And in fact, my civilian employer came in, being a law enforcement agency, and just violated my rights under all the Soldiers and Sailors Relief Act. It really upset a lot of people, and the Army stood behind me, thank God.
Yeah, I want to hear I know that you've been on the MBR before, and I know you're on Amber's show, Into the Weeds podcast, and you kind of told your story. But I know that there's some people that still haven't heard your story. So I guess, can you pick up where you just left off, where you got the job with Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, and you started as a correction officer, and then you changed to the Army Reserve, and so can you just pick it up from there and kind of say what transpired?
Yeah, sure. I mean, even before that transition from Guard to Reserve, I got the job with the Sheriff's Office, and I started with the Academy in late 2009 and actually started working with them full-time as an officer in the spring of 2010. At that time, I was still in the Guard. Even before this whole debacle happened, almost immediately after I got hired, there was just a lot of animosity with certain members of leadership with JSO in regards to people who were in the military part-time. I was having problems almost immediately after getting hired, which I don't know why, but there were just a lot of supervisors that didn't like the fact that we got an extra paycheck and that the Sheriff's Office gave us paid leave to go off and do our duty for 30 days out of the year. So yeah, I mean, it was just unfortunate. There was one instance where a supervisor was ordering me to provide documentation that didn't exist in regards to my military leave. And fortunately, one of my FTOs, I was in training, he stood up for me, and we went to our watch commander. My watch commander was able to resolve that right away. There was another instance where the lieutenant, in conjunction with the sergeant who was involved in this most serious issue, they were trying to keep me on probation for taking military leave, even after I cited the laws, the actual statutes and federal law that protected me from that happening. They were still trying to make me go along with it. I ended up having to move facilities over that one, and yeah, I really don't understand. You know, part of me, you know, there were a couple times I wanted to quit and switch other agencies, but I'd moved from 2 states to get this job. I relocated, you know, bought another house. You know, I went through almost a full year in the hiring process, back and forth for interviews, polygraphs, medical appointments. It's like I really went through a lot to get this job, and I didn't want to just give it up over a couple of arrogant supervisors who had a difference of opinion or didn't understand how things worked in that world. So I decided to stick with it. But yeah, unfortunately, the most serious incident happened in 2013. I went into the reserves. My contract with the Guard had expired. I switched over to the reserves. I went through that whole process with, MEPS. I even had to go to basic training again as an E5 with 11 years. And that was very interesting.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. I could write a memoir just on that. I've actually been encouraged to. But anyway,
interesting.
So anyway, yeah, I was going through all these extra duty days. The Army gave me a top secret clearance. I was taking time off to go do all this extra training. And then finally, after all this culmination of, all this work and all these interviews and all this back and forth, and, I finally got the orders to go to do the MOS training for the intelligence field I was going into. I was really excited. I was like, finally, after all this time, I'm going to get to do it. Well, a couple months prior to this, the lieutenant I worked for had ordered me to switch one of my military days from a military day to a personal vacation day, because her argument was the day that I was not at work, I didn't actually have to report in for military duty, which is very normal. It's like any other job. You don't necessarily go in every day. Your orders are active. And so after contacting my unit, they even said, yeah, you had orders. There's nothing wrong with what you did. But if that's your civilian employer's policy, you need to go by what they tell you. So I contacted someone higher up in the sheriff's office, and they said the same thing. Like, well, yeah, you're fine. But if you don't do it, this lieutenant had a reputation for being very vindictive and very two-faced, and said, yeah, if you don't do it, she's going to write you up for insubordination. So you might as well just go ahead and do it. She's asking you to do for whatever reason. So I did.
Yeah.
She denied that leave request she ordered me to make, and filed a false complaint against me with our integrity division, if you want to call them that. They clearly did not have any integrity, as I found out later.
Right.
So I was like, whoa, what the hell's going on with this? So I called some people. I talked to a lawyer within the sheriff's office that was, we had a union. I talked to the lawyer within our union, and then some other people, and they all told me the same thing. They're like, yeah, you have orders to back up all your duty days. You should be fine. This is just something she's doing to, mess with you or whatever. And the integrity detectives will do their jobs. They'll find your orders on file. And because I'd never been granted leave without having orders, like I had to submit that documentation in order to take time off. Like, you just can't walk in and say, hey, I need this time off. You had to produce documentation, and it was all on file.
Right.
So I was never really that worried after all that. So several months went by, and I got the orders to go out of state for, I think it was a total of 4 months for my training. And the weekend before I was supposed to leave, I was scheduled to fly out on a Monday morning. I was married to my ex-wife at the time. We had some family over that weekend. We had kind of a get together and, did some family things. And I took off the Friday, Saturday, and Sunday before I was supposed to leave, just to have some free time with my family. Well, that Friday afternoon, I'm sitting in my living room at my house, which is not in Jacksonville. It was up in Nassau County, which is the next county north. And I live on this big rural lot out there. It's on a corner of two roads in my neighborhood. And I noticed there was a white unmarked sedan parked on the side of the road. Like, it's just one of those things you can't not notice a car parked. It's not like a city street. If there's a car parked there that doesn't live there. I thought, I wonder what that's all about. I didn't know who it was. So about 2:00 in the afternoon, I think it was, I'm sitting in my living room, and my garage door was open, and I get a loud knock at my garage door, not the front door of the house, but the garage door. These people came in through the garage. I go to the door, I open it, and there's 4 guys there wearing like semi-tack gear. They're wearing their vests and all this other stuff. And I open the door, and I'm like, can I help you guys? And one of them said, are you Ian Murray? I said, yeah. And one of them said, Corrections Officer Murray? I'm like, yeah. And one of them grabs me and cuffs me and says, we have a warrant for your arrest. And I started chuckling at first. I thought it was a joke. Like, I thought some of my friends at work were maybe just playing like some of them knew this was going on. So the investigation was going on. I thought they were just playing a prank or something. And, I'm like, are you serious? They're like, yes, we're serious. And I was like, okay. So next thing I know, we're back in my house. They take me back into my house, and like 2 of them go back into the back of my house. One of them used the bathroom. I don't know if that was just like a power grab or something, but So I called my wife and like, I didn't even know what to, to tell her. I just had to tell her like, yeah, this is happening. So, fortunately, we had the means. They tried charging me with 3 charges. They all had a bond. Fortunately, we had enough money. My stepfather was in town and he had enough cash to, get me out of jail pretty quickly. But yeah, they took me down to the jail. They started questioning me at their little office area and started asking me like, well, where were you this day? Where were you that day? And I'm like, well, what did my orders say?
Right.
And it became pretty clear at that point, either they didn't go look for my orders or they had, and they were just trying to somehow omit them from, this whole report, to try and, fluff up the charges. But, yeah, I couldn't believe it. I'm like, you guys can't be serious, and I even said, at one point, like, well, look, you take me back to the house, let me go, and, we'll deal with this later. I'm supposed to fly out of town on military orders. And, they pretended that they didn't know that, but it was pretty obvious that they did. And, they started making excuses. Well, if you've just been more cooperative, I'm like, how cooperative do I need to be? You're the investigators. It's your job to find this stuff out. I mean, everything you needed was right there at your fingertips, And so, yeah, they took me down to the jail. One of my friends, actually, who I worked with, booked me into the jail.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he couldn't believe it. He tried to keep everything as discreet as possible. They let me make a couple phone calls to update my family what was going on. But about an hour after they got done with the whole booking thing, I was photographed and fingerprinted, and I had to go through the whole process like everyone else does. And then one of my other friends came to the holding cell and he's like, yeah, dude, I'm sorry, but it's all over the news. So apparently the detectives ran to the media, to try and sell. And they basically sold a hatful of lies to the media. So yeah, that it was all over the place. My wife came down with, got me out of jail, went home. And we were just like, holy hell, like what just happened? What's going on? So we, we were in contact with my military command over the weekend, and like one of them even called me. He heard about it on the news. Like that's how a lot of them heard about this, was listening to the news. It made the second page of the Florida Times-Union. They put it on the media, during drive time, so everyone driving home from work, heard about it, who was listening to the radio or whatever. And yeah, it was unbelievable. And so, yeah, they called me and they said, listen, unfortunately we can't let you fly out because your clearance is being flagged because you're pending criminal charges. They tried charging me several of the dates. They were trying to charge me like that I allegedly wasn't on military duty. It was when I was at MEPS going through the whole branch switching process, and I had orders for that. So like that, that weekend I called the I called the recruiter for the reserves, and yeah, he even heard about what happened. He's like, yeah, dude, I don't know what the hell happened, man. I'm so sorry. And he's like, I already emailed you all your documentation for when we sent you to MEPS. So I gathered that, my drill calendars. And the first thing Monday morning is I called this lawyer who I'd been talking to within the sheriff's office union. And this is the same guy who'd been telling me the whole time, you did nothing wrong. If you got orders, you're fine. And, his suddenly switched to saying something like, well, first he offered to represent me pretty much for free. Then he said he could get me a plea deal where if I was vested, I wouldn't lose my pension. And I'm like, what does that mean? He's like, well, you're being charged with a felony. I can boil it down to a misdemeanor for you. I'm like,
yeah, no, thanks.
Yeah. I'm like, but you told me I did nothing wrong. And, he was even articulating like, well, if they got a judge to sign a warrant, you must be guilty. I'm like, are you kidding me right now?
Right. Well, we need to take a quick break, so we'll
Sure.
pick up the story right after that. So we're going to hear Dallas Alexander, last picture of Johnny Cash. He's a Special Forces. He was a Special Forces Canadian soldier before he retired, and now he's a country singer.
Cool.
Wonder what was going
inside the man in black's mind? Was he missing June? Was he thinking back when that picture was snapped? Was he wishing he could hold her? Did he know his life was over? The day that camera flashed the last picture of Johnny Cash. The lines of life there on his face show hard living and show grace. A story told in shades of black. Was he whispering a prayer through that cold and lonesome glare? The day the camera flashed the last picture of Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash. The lines of life there on his face show hard living and show grace. A story told in shades of black. Was he whispering a prayer through that cold and lonesome glare? The day the camera flashed the last picture of Johnny Cash. Wonder what was going on inside the man in black's mind. The day old Marty flashed the last picture of Johnny Cash.
Opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Find us on the web at mbradio.us.
Welcome back to Tracer Rounds, and I'm talking with Ian Murray today, and we are talking about his problems at work. It's more than problems. It's a lawsuit. It's legal. It's a big mess. Really, because it's somebody with a vendetta trying to make a point, and they tried to make the point so much that they had to perpetuate what was going on because you wouldn't back down and you wouldn't give up. And so they were like, man, we got to keep going. We got to keep going. And it got bigger and bigger and bigger. The snowball kept turning and got bigger and bigger till finally it came to where we left off, where you were detained or arrested, and then you were released on a bond. And then you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, sure. So as I was saying, yeah, I talked to this lawyer, and he went from telling me I did nothing wrong to telling me he could get me a plea deal. And I was just like, yeah, no. And my stepfather had a really close friend who's been practicing law for decades, and we went and talked to him, and of course he said that, like, the complete opposite, like, yeah, this is total BS, you know, they can't do this to you. And so needless to say, I hired him. Within a week of hiring him, those detectives probably did more investigating than they had the whole 4 months prior. They went to my Army unit, tried to question my full-time staff, and my full-time staff told them to pound sand pretty much. They're like, yeah, you didn't even call us or come talk to us once prior to this during your so-called investigation.
Right.
And we're not going to help you now. So they came back and basically with an investigative subpoena and tried to threaten my first sergeant, my training NCO, and basically try to intimidate them into cooperating. And one of them jumped out of his desk and said, "I'm going to tell you something right now. You get the hell out of my office. And if you come back here again, I'm calling Fox News. I'm going to tell them the JSO is harassing an Army unit, and they arrested one of their own employees for serving in the military." And that was the last we heard, well, they heard from that particular section of detectives. So, but yeah, this went on for a couple more months. The state attorney even looked at the case, and like I said, before Monday morning, I already had all my ducks in a row with documentation. My lawyer turned it over to them and like, well, here's everything that was already on file. And they were just like, holy hell, you know, the state attorney looked at it and was like, I can't prosecute this guy. You know, he didn't do anything wrong.
Right.
And so he gave the sheriff's office like another 2 months to try and dig up, you know, what dirt they could on me, but there was none. So he finally came back and said, I have to drop the case. And we found out later, like, not only did he not, like, he didn't even like drop the case. He never even did the paperwork for the case. Like, there was never even any pending charges against me. Like, I was arrested, but no charges were actually filed. Like, that's
crazy.
How weak this whole thing was from the get-go. And not to mention, about a month before that happened, the authority that does my security clearance came in and looked at it. They came in and interviewed my first sergeant, my command, and everything. And they even said, is this some kind of a joke? Like, is this guy really having to deal with this right now? And my first sergeant's like, yeah, I'm afraid so. And they're like, oh, heck yeah. Like a week later after that, they gave me my clearance back. So, you know, that really made the sheriff's office mad. That, you know, like I said, the Army, I don't think they were expecting the Army to stand behind me as well as they did, you know, but that was the true, you know, I guess the ultimate reprieve for me in this was how much my military stood behind me. You know, I've given a lot to the military, and this is where it gave a lot back to me.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the criminal case got dropped. Never, you know, no charges were ever even filed. No paperwork was done. So, the sheriff's office decides, like, well, we got to save face. So they made it an internal affairs thing. They turned it over to internal affairs to try and basically see if I did something wrong administratively. Like, that was going to be their saving grace. Like, they figured this is their second shot. So my lawyer did two things when we found that out. The first thing he did was he drafted a letter to internal affairs reminding them that I was represented and to contact my lawyers should they have any questions or need to get a hold of me.
Right.
The second thing he did was he took the entire case file and gave it to the, I think it was the city manager. And the city manager looked it over, and about 3 weeks later sent back a letter saying, we've reviewed this whole case and have determined that Mr. Murray has not broken any rules or violated any policies within the sheriff's office or the city rules. So, you know, I was like, okay, cool. But needless to say, they weren't going to let it go without a fight. You know, they had to try and get something on me to try and save face. So, as they're doing their investigating, the detective who was they assigned, like, I found out he was actually in the military. So at first I was like, okay, cool. You know, finally, maybe they're trying to do it the right way this time.
Right.
They actually put someone in there who knows what they're doing. But yeah, I was pretty wrong about that. This internal affairs detective, I think his name was Malir. He was in the Air Force Air Guard, and he was an OSI agent, Office of Special Investigations agent.
You're right.
The reason I know that is because people from my command were calling me and saying, yeah, this guy, instead of going on around, and he was going to like my brigade, my battalion level command, you know, not just my unit command or my company command, but like way high up, knocking on people's doors saying, I'm Special Agent Malir with OSI. I need to talk to you about one of your soldiers, instead of saying, I'm Detective Malir with JSO.
Right.
So he was falsely identifying himself.
Right.
And
he was using what they thought would get him in the door and get him some traction with you, because somebody from outside the organization, not inside DOD, doesn't have as much traction as somebody inside. So I'm sure he was using his position in the Air Force just to get his leg in the door and get them to listen to him.
Well, and, you know, the thing is too, like, you know, he I guess he just maybe had the false notion that when it comes to, you know, to the Army, he thought maybe we were all just a bunch of infantry guys or something like that. Because like these high-ranking officers are telling him, like, you do know we're an intelligence unit, right? We know what you're doing is wrong. You're not supposed to be doing this.
Yeah.
And that didn't seem to deter him. So, yeah, my lawyer went around and deposed a bunch of these people and got statements from them. And then when it came time to contacting me, I got a phone call. He called me directly on my cell phone. And I'm like, did you not get the letter my lawyer sent you when this whole thing started? And he starts yelling at me over the phone, like, I'm not asking, you're going to cooperate, you know, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, you're going to come in and talk to me. And I'm like, right. You know, it's kind of like I had that kind of Dr. Evil thing, you know, from Austin Powers. Like,
Right.
so I pulled my truck over and I said, what's your name? He gave me his name. I said, what's your ID? What's your phone number? I said, okay, someone will be in touch. So as soon as I got home, I called my lawyer and just told him what had happened. He's like, all right, I'll deal with this. Well, yeah, every time this detective called, you know, he tried to call me first. And I just ignored his calls. I told him point blank, I'm not acknowledging any communications from you people. You know, you've got my lawyer's number. You need to call him.
Right.
Well, finally, my lawyer says, let's go in and give them their statement. This way we can say what, you know, we did cooperate and that, you know, maybe it'll help smooth this whole thing over. So we go in, you know, and the line of questioning, being in an intelligence unit, it's like, I'm like trying to like, the line of questioning this guy had was just, I'm like, he pretty much asked me to justify what everybody else had done. You know, like, because the one day, this all boiled down to that one day where my lieutenant ordered me to switch days.
Right.
Like, you know, they at this point, they'd thrown out the MEPS. There was one instance where when I had to go to basic training, my orders got extended. Someone back home extended my leave on my behalf. I had nothing to do with it. And he was trying to get me to explain that. I'm like, I wasn't there. I can't do anything about that.
Right.
But, you know, he's asking me to explain, well, why would this person do this? He even asked me to explain why my military command would do something different than his military command. And like, I'm looking over at my lawyer and like the whole time he's just shaking his head like, this is unbelievable. Like, it's just, you know, and like you could just tell they were so desperate to pull straws. They were just trying to get anything they could. And
they were digging deep, trying to find something.
Yeah, just trying to find anything. And so finally, when the interview was over, we left, you know, I left and I finally got to go back to my training that had been postponed from the original arrest.
Right.
Well, I'm out in Arizona and I start getting like voicemails from this detective again, wanting me to call him. And so I called my lawyer and I'm like, hey, this guy's calling me. He's like, yeah, he's been calling us too. And he wants you to come in. Apparently they've concluded their investigation, but they will only discuss it if you're here in person. I'm like, well, I'm obviously not there. I'm going to be in Arizona for another few weeks. He's like, all right. So he calls this detective back, says, yeah, Mr. Murray's on orders out in Arizona. And the detective throws a complete fit on the phone. You know, he's yelling and screaming like, what do you mean he's on orders? He's not supposed to be on. I guess like, because they were under the impression, maybe they thought that they didn't realize how much the military was standing behind me. They thought maybe I was like on a suspended without pay status from the military.
Right.
Well, the next day I'm sitting in my class. My chief pulls me out of class and pulls me into a separate room and says, can you tell me about your arrest? I'm like, how'd you find out about that?
Yeah.
This detective had actually called the schoolhouse I was at just to let them know I'd been arrested to try and get me thrown out of my training. Had nothing to do with his investigation. Like they were just trying to further disrupt my life.
Being vindictive, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, I get back. Unfortunately, I had to go home early because my grandfather passed away and I had to go to his funeral. And he was a highly decorated World War II veteran. So they let me go home to pay my respects to him. Well, I get back from the funeral. We go in to talk to these internal affairs detectives. And of course, the detective who was doing the investigating doesn't even show up. Two of his colleagues do. They still tried to sustain allegations against me and were recommending I be fired. And my lawyer is like drooling. He's like, oh, this is great. We can sue him for wrongful termination too.
Right.
So I'm like, okay, so like, what are our options? So the option I ended up choosing was to have a civil service hearing. What the civil service hearing would have done would have taken it beyond the sheriff's department. It would have basically had someone who's not wearing a badge and doesn't work for JSO, but has authority within the city to look at this case and decide, that I did nothing wrong.
Right.
So when we opted for that, apparently that's another option where a lot of people didn't choose that. Most people would either go to like arbitration or mediation, but I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. We're going to go straight to the top on this one. I'm tired of messing around with these people. So we opted for the civil service hearing. The sheriff's department delayed it like for 3 months. Like every time we got close to getting a date, they'd like all of a sudden have some reason why they couldn't do it. So finally my lawyer got it locked in. He's like, okay, we're going to have it on this day. I think it was supposed to happen around end of October of 2015, like a year and a half after this whole thing had been going on.
That's crazy.
So we finally we're getting ready for the civil service hearing. My lawyer's prepared. He's got all his ducks in a row. I've got my ducks in a row. And my lawyer calls me about 4 days before the hearing and says the undersheriff, his name's Pat Ivy. He'd like us to come in and, as he put it, potentially resolve the whole thing. And at first I was like, no, I don't want to deal with this anymore. I'm tired of dealing with these people. They've had their chance to do all this. Like, we'll just take it to the hearing. So he calls back and says, well, the undersheriff is willing to reduce the whole thing from firing you to a 10-day suspension. I said, I'm not agreeing to that.
No.
I said, I'm not doing it.
Right.
And, another thing is too, before it got to this point, I left something out. About a month before that got to this point, the union president, I'm sorry, you still there?
Yep.
Yeah, I dropped my phone. I'm sorry. The union president called me and was trying to get me to take a deal for a suspension. I told him not interested.
Yeah.
And then, this is the same guy. He told me I did nothing wrong. And then he comes out and says, well, the reason I really want to get this resolved because the sheriff's election's coming up, and Sheriff Rutherford, who was sheriff when this whole thing happened, is he's a congressman now. He was going into politics and didn't want to, possibly tainting his political career. And I'm like, that's not my problem.
Right. Yeah. I got no dog in that fight.
So anyway, we go, my lawyer is like, let's just go see this undersheriff. And again, the whole objective is to say we did everything we could to try and resolve this thing. And so anyway, we go to Pat Ivy's office. We go to the police memorial building. We walk in. My lawyers and I sit, across from at his desk, and he's got one of his city lawyers sitting in the corner taking notes. And he starts asking me more and more questions. And I'm like, my lawyers are like saying, this is a career military reservist. He's an NCO. He's not some, young private. Trying to just, and then, he brought up the whole fact that we have proof that his detectives had falsely identified themselves. And he just didn't care. Like, he was determined to ram his 10-day suspension deal down my throat. And I said, like, we weren't going to take it.
Right.
It got so bad to the point where, like, he was even arguing the one day I was off on, that I didn't report in from duty. He's like arguing I could have still come to work. I'm like, no, you don't. When you have military orders, that's your day. You don't go in to your civilian job. Your obligation is to the military, but he just didn't want to hear it. So anyway, it got so bad where I just wouldn't agree with him. He threw me out of his office, told me to go wait in the lobby. And I was like, even after that, my lawyers, like, were still trying to make him understand, like, we weren't going to back down from this. Like, so we ended up leaving. Like, it's so funny because, like, we'd made it intent for like months prior that we were going to have the civil service hearing. The next day I start getting phone calls from some members of my unit saying they're just now getting like subpoena commands to come in for the civil service hearing. Like, the sheriff's office hadn't even prepared to have this hearing. They figured I would just take a deal. They clearly learned nothing from the criminal case, but
right.
Yeah. And I'm like, I told him, like, well, I don't know what's going to happen, but, it is what it is. If you can't make it, just tell them you can't make it. We told him 4 months ago we were going to have this hearing. So A couple days after that first interaction, my lawyer calls me and says they're offering to give you like over $10,000 in back pay. If you just, if you'll waive the civil service hearing. I'm like, okay, do I have to agree to the disciplinary charges? They're like, yeah, that's part of it. I said, nope, not doing it.
No.
When I didn't do that, that's when the harassment campaign from Pat Ivy started happening. People started showing up at my house. My ex-wife claimed she was being followed to and from work several times by unmarked police cars. One particular day, I don't remember what I was doing, but my wife was alone in the house, and my neighbor told me that a large gentleman pulled up in a white unmarked sedan, got out of his car. He was wearing a polo shirt with a JSO sew-on badge. He walked up to my front door, was kicking on my front door. And when he walked up to the fence line, started taking pictures of the guy's car, the guy left.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, I started getting all these missed phone calls. They were leaving voicemails. Like within a day of the hearing, they were like trying to get me to come back to work all of a sudden after a year and a half.
Yeah, no.
And of course, they were trying to use the excuse, well, if he doesn't come back to work, we can't, he's not eligible to have the hearing. My lawyer's like, yeah, he is. He's still
Right.
employed, and you are required to give him a certain amount of notice after being out of work for so much time before he's required to come back.
Right.
So, like literally, we got up to the 11th hour. I think it was literally the night before the civil service hearing where they said, we'll give him all his back pay and drop everything if he just doesn't show up, just like waives the hearing, which is the end result I wanted anyway. So yeah, they dropped all the disciplinary allegations. I got to, check for my back pay. I had to give some of it to my lawyers for all the work they did, of course, but, I ended up resigning, of course. There was no way I was going to go back to work after all that. But, I didn't get fired. That was finally the end of that ordeal. We obviously knew there was going to be a civil lawsuit that my lawyer was going to file. That drug on for another several years. In the meantime, I went back to the school, finished my training in 2016, got deployed to Afghanistan in 2017. So the whole idea was when I got back from Afghanistan, we were going to file the lawsuit and start that process. Unfortunately, while I was over in Afghanistan, my wife left me, so I ended up having to go through a divorce. That went on for almost another year.
Good grief.
And then finally, when that was
worse.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's like the storm that never ends. I'm over in Afghanistan, and this was a subject of while I was in Afghanistan because people were coming up and asking me about it and things like that. I had to explain it a lot to my command, members of my command and stuff like that. And then finally I get back from Afghanistan. We go through the divorce gets finalized, and then my lawyer finally files the lawsuit. And the sheriff even tried to put my lawyer on these task force with the sheriff's office in an effort to create conflict of interest, to try and just make the lawsuit more difficult. And then finally, it got to the point. It was kind of like the everything else. We got to the 11th hour. It was about to start going into court hearings, and the detectives who were involved with this, their defense was they played dumb. They basically said, well, we thought we'd done our job, even though when they called me, I told them all my orders are on file. If you can't find them, call me. I'll email them. I'll even bring them over to you and hand deliver them. They never did that. Their defense was they played dumb. Like, we thought we'd done our job. And these are people with college degrees that had been in the sheriff's department for a long time. But that was their defense. They still did settle out of court. It wasn't for a huge amount of money, but I did end up getting a out of court settlement. And to my understanding, there have been massive policy revisions within the sheriff's department, particularly those two agencies, the Integrity and the Internal Affairs Division, where when the detectives are investigating one of their own, they have to get approval from their chain of command before they can go to a judge or take action on making an arrest. So, yeah, it was a terrible thing for me, but I'd like to think I made it easier for the next person they might have done this to. And, I'm hoping maybe by getting this story out, I'm sure there's other people going through other situations in other parts of the country. Maybe if they hear this, they'll know they can fight back, that they don't have to give in.
Right.
That there are resources out there to help them. So
we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll wrap up our conversation, and then we'll kind of ask some final questions and let you give some final thoughts. We're going to hear Child of This Land, Dallas Alexander.
Everywhere I go, trouble seems to find me. There ain't no place that I fit in. Raised in the backwoods, and just like him, oh, I'm a fighting man. Well, I was born with a gun in my hand, child of this land. Lord, please save me from my sins, out here howling in the wind. Look to the west, see your sunset. Someday kneel at the pew. This old wasteland, it is my land. Around here I do what I wanna do. Well, I was born with a gun in my hand, child of this land. Lord, please save me from my sins, out here howling in the wind. Well, I was born with a gun in my hand, child of this land. Lord, please save me from my sins, out here howling in the wind. Everywhere I go, trouble seems to find me. There ain't no place that I fit in.
Opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Find us on the web at mbradio.us.
Welcome back to Tracer Rounds and the Tracer Rounds podcast show with Ian Murray. And we have been talking about his legal troubles with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. And so basically, though, from start to finish, this whole thing has gone on 13 years. Is that right?
To this point, no, it's
Because it started in 2009 and it ended in 2022 with the end of the lawsuit, right? So
Well,
it's been
the
about 30.
primary incident happened in 2014.
Oh,
So the lawsuit, yeah, start to finish, from the investigation start to the lawsuit settlement, that was about 8 years.
that's a long time. That's resilience on your part and persistence. I mean, like, you really have to be just all for getting this taken care of and done, because a weaker person or a person with less conviction on what's going on would have said, okay, I'm tapping out, enough's enough, I'll take what they're giving me and I'll just walk away. But for you to stand firm to your belief and stand true to yourself, because I mean, truly, you didn't do anything wrong. Truly, it was about them having a problem with you being a reservist and taking time off of work to do reserve duty. That's really what it amounted to. And she wanted to make a point to you about that. And when you wouldn't just say, okay, I give, you're right, whatever, you didn't give her that authority um, to tell you it's okay. Then she just had to go off the deep end over the whole thing. So let me ask you this: why are you still telling the story? Is it because you want to help somebody else not be in the same position? Is it because you really want to say that these things do happen and that others can maybe find some solace in what happened to you and understand that other people have to deal with this too? Like, what's your reasoning behind it?
Well, to be honest, at first, I wanted to clear my name because those negative false headlines were all over the place. And I wanted to get my side of the story out to the public. And that way they knew the other side of this whole thing. But as time went on, yes, like you said, I wanted to use my voice to help other people. Because as I said before, this probably has happened to, or is happening to someone else. And if they hear this story, they'll know that they don't have to give up. If they're right, that's something I was always told. If you're wrong, admit you're wrong, own your mistakes. They teach you that in the military. But they also tell me and everybody else, if you're right, if you didn't do anything wrong, don't admit to doing something you didn't do. Stand firm. The truth will set you free. And in this case, it did. It took a long time and it cost me a lot of my livelihood, but it did set me free. I came out, on top of this whole thing. And, that's like just those detectives having to basically admit that they were too dumb to do their jobs.
Or that they didn't do it at all. Like,
Or they didn't do them at all.
They really weren't even trying to do it. They just were giving orders from somebody else. Somebody else was telling them what to do. They were doing it and just following through with that, not following through with an investigation.
Well, there's more to it than that, I think, because the detectives who arrested me, I found out, like, just from talking to them, a lot of them were either, one, they were police officers coming off the street trying to climb the ladder into the detective world, or two, they'd been demoted from another detective section. Like, one guy I talked to had been a homicide detective for 20 years.
Oh, wow.
When I asked him, so why did you go from being a homicide detective to doing this? He didn't even answer me. So, a lot of them were just trying to, either make a name for themselves or regain, their investigative status that they thought they'd had.
Right.
But that's a scary thought too, because if they did this to me, like, what are they doing to people who are under investigation for crimes like murder and rape and, robbery? Like, how many people are they putting in prison and in jail for things they didn't even do?
Well, if you don't have the money or the resources to fight and you're at the mercy of a public defender, well, if the public defender has no dog in the fight and doesn't care
Exactly.
what the outcome is, like, he's like not really hearing you and doesn't really care if you go to jail or not. He's just representing you because he has to check that block. You get what you get. Some are really good, and I definitely want to say that, but I will say that some really don't care much. So if you don't have the resources behind you to hire a good attorney, you may end up, copping to something you never did. In my opinion, of late, we have a legal system, not a justice system.
Correct. Yeah, I'll agree with you on that. I'm just glad. And that's the problem. My lawyer even said if they'd actually investigated, me as a person, like saw that I was financially responsible, that, I did have the resources to fight this, they probably would have never done it. Because their tactic is they do this to you, they put you on leave without pay, they publicly humiliate you.
Yeah.
Like their whole idea is we're going to starve them into submission. That was their tactic, and it didn't work. Not for me anyway, but it has worked. The sad thing is that same union president told me they've done this to people and gotten away with it because people just can't fight it.
Right. Or just don't want to have that hassle. Like they just like enough's enough. It's a bridge too far. I'm not going to worry about it. It's not that big a deal. So I wanted you to know that our president, Joel, was on, and he was saying, we have your back, and he's really appreciating your story. And MJ was thanking you for your service, and Red's on, and they have different podcasts on our platform, The World of Conscious Positive Thinking on Mondays at 8 with MJ, and then Red has one on Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock Central. The Red's Roundtable and Freedom from Struggle. And Joel is always a big supporter of all of us. So we just want you to know that we have your back here on this platform, because we understand those struggles, because I've faced some of those too, not to the degree you have. So I can't say that I've walked in those shoes, but I have walked in the shoes where I know that sometimes being a reservist can give you trouble at work, because some people don't understand what that means and what that looks like and what they have to allow, because they're just not educated. And that's kind of what happened in your case. I think your lieutenant just wasn't educated.
And it wasn't just her, it was a lot of other people.
So do you have any final thoughts? Because we've got just about 3 minutes before we have to play our outgoing video. And so I'd just like to give you the floor for the last 3 minutes if you have something you want to say to our audience tonight.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, being in the reserves and working a full-time job can be a real challenge. In fact, like the last several years, I just finished my my second college degree. I've been a full-time student, working a job, and being in the reserves. It's a challenge. A lot of people think being in the reserves is a picnic, that it's just a glory weekend, and it's not all the time anyway. And so if you're listening to this and you are in a position of leadership and you have people working for you that are in the Guard or the reserves, don't just assume that they're just off getting an extra paycheck for sitting around playing poker all weekend. There's a lot of extra work involved, not only on that weekend, but there's requirements they have to maintain during the month.
Yes.
There's training they have to do. There's online compliance training. They have to be medically ready. So yeah, having it just finished I just finished my bachelor's degree in management, and that was something I actually wrote a lot of papers on, was the importance of understanding the laws and the regulations of military reservists for employers. Like I think I wrote at least two papers on that throughout my degree plan. And because that's just something that's not talked about very much. You see these big companies, and they talk about vacation time, they talk about maternity leave and bereavement leave. You don't ever hear them talking about military leave. And
not
that is
much, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean I agree that it's not as much of a popular type of leave, but it's still very important, because there are federal laws and rules that protect service members in regards to their jobs. Like, you can't just, if they have to go off and do what they have to do, you can't just fire them or suspend them. You have to honor their position while they're out either on a deployment or a drill or doing anything.
Well,
so
we're going to have to wrap it up because we've got another show coming on. But I wanted to thank you, Ian, for being on the show and for telling your story and kind of getting the word out there so that you can help somebody else, and then clear your name too, and just get your innocence out there. So I wanted to say thank you, and Tracer Rounds is out.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in to Military Broadcast Radio. As we wrap up today's show, we want to remind you that the podcast of today's episode will be available right after we go off the air. So if you missed any part of the show or want to listen again, be sure to check it out. And remember, we're here to support and honor our veterans. Your stories and experiences matter, and we are committed to giving you a platform to share them. That's right. We're here to give our veterans a voice. So don't forget to catch the podcast and stay connected with us. Giving our veterans a voice.